Welcome back to part 5 of this series. There's a lot to cover, so I'm just going to try to get started. So when picking your fabric, you just want to make sure that it is nice and uniform. Notice those are like little imperfections in the fabric. Here we have all of the pieces already cut, and I'm showing you the different dimensions. I just won't mention them for the sake of time because there's just so much in this last video that I want to be as thorough as I can. So you'll see the measurements there. There are a total of 6 pieces. And I use one long piece for this starting point just because I want the hat to be as uniform as possible on both sides, front and back and left and right. So this is totally up to you. I'm just showing you how I make it, and then the more times that you make it, some of you be making it more than once, some of you might be making it just this one time. But just for your reference, this is how I make it so that you can figure out which way works best for you. So once it's pinned in the front, I like to work from the back since that's not yet secured. And notice I'm showing you how I sew the fabric in. This is the way that I sew it throughout the entire hat, just to be consistent, because sometimes I find that even though right now where I'm sewing you don't see it in the finished product since it's going to be covered by more purple fabric, I just keep it in the habit of making sure that this is the method I use, because in the past if I don't use a consistent method and I forget, I'll accidentally make a huge long strand show through the fabric in the finished product. So I just try to be as consistent as I can. And as you can see there, I make the needle go back into the same, literally one cell of fabric over from where it came out of. That way you have like minimal thread showing. So here is the finished product. It's all sewn on, and now we start sewing the side pieces together. So the ultimate goal when putting in the side pieces is just to make sure that they are uniform on each side. So I use pins to help guide me. I know that I didn't mention that pins were required in the beginning. It's totally optional. I found that it helps me guide where the fabrics go so that they'll stay in place when I actually sew them. So again, totally optional, totally up to you. It works for me, that's why I use them. And then I just play around with it, make sure that each side looks the same height, and also where it curves, those should be uniform as well. So just play around and see how it works for you. As you can see, I put a little bit of time into it just to make sure that to start off it looks good. That way the finishing product is guaranteed to hopefully look good. And here you see I am pinching in the edge of the fabric in so that that rough edge isn't seen. And then once I finish doing that along the beginning first 5 inches or so, I just start sewing. And I use the same method as I mentioned before. And now our first piece is sewn in, and you can take out the pins and you can see how it is sewn on and it's not going to go anywhere. And now both sides are similar, and it doesn't have to be quite perfect because that's just the way it goes sometimes, but you just try your best. And now I'm going to put in the bottom parts to both sides. And now that step is done. Notice that there's excess fabric. So in the beginning, I believe these are about 2 inches or almost 3 inches in width. I like having extra because you can't go backwards. So even if you have to cut off a little bit, that's fine. Just cut off whatever is hanging over the hat because you don't want that to disturb the next step in wrapping the one long strand. So I just trim around the top and the bottom. And then this next step, since you notice that the top and bottom fabrics, they're a little bit loose, and this hat is ultimately a tight fabric woven all the way around. So I just tighten up the ends on both sides, and I just sew them in place to make sure that they are taut. So this portion really helps when making that nice and tight look. So I do this to the top and bottom of the hat for the front and back portion of the hat to make sure that the fabric is nice and tight on both sides all the way around. But just remember not to pull too hard because you don't want to distort the shape of the hat either. Now this next step that I'm going to be showing you is, I think, optional if you don't want to take that extra step, but I think it makes the finished product look nice. Now I've noticed in other hats at the stores that they do this as well, and it's just basically to cover the bottom inside of the tail. And so you see there the rough edge with the sewing, you don't want to see that. So I just take a scrap of the purple fabric. It doesn't really matter if it's like really nice fabric or not, as long as it just looks okay. Since you're just going to roll it up and tie it in place. So you just want to cover it, wrap it around, sew it in place, and then with the excess fabric, you're just going to snip those off. And you'll see that when finished, it just looks nice with that closure piece hidden in the back. See, doesn't that look better? All covered up. Now we're gonna start off with the one long strand, and so you just wrap it like so. I had a difficult time understanding how to wrap it because I found it to be confusing, so I had to ask my sister-in-law, Auntie Pao, and you know, we call each other Auntie Pao, or you know, whatever our children call each other. So I had to ask my Auntie Pao, and of course she's awesome, and she was helping me direct how to wrap it. And I've used the black and white zebra stripe here to demonstrate, just since it's, you know, that contrast is higher, so you'll be able to see the direction of the fabric. So from the back to the front, to the back, and then to the front again, and then to the back again. So you can rewind that if that was confusing, but you can have both ways to look at it. The one with the the purple fabric, and then the one with the black and white zebra fabric. So here we are. Everything I do, I try to pin it in place ahead of time so it'll guide my sewing. So just remember to think ahead, since you can manipulate the fabric and pull it, which is helpful. So this fabric is so sensitive, it's so easily rippable, which works against us because we're, you know, sewing in and out, pinning it in and out. But what does work to our advantage is that when we are sewing it, we can really pinch in the edges so that the raw edges don't come through. You can't really see them. So that helps making the finished product look nice. So at the very beginning, you want to make sure that it's even with the way that the fabric folds, since you want to make the sides look nice with those curves. And then I just start sewing. And again, using the same method as I've used previously. And just making sure that we adjust the fabric as we go along. So here we are already at the front, and just still pinning and sewing away. And especially since it's in the front, which is the most visible part, because when you look at somebody, you look at the front of their face. Just like when you look at a hat, you look at the front. So just making sure that that is close to being perfect. And at the very edge there, you just want to make sure that the sewing makes the purple fabric go all the way to the edge as much as possible. So here we are already towards the end of sewing the long strand in. We've sewed the outer edge of the fabric, now it's just the interior. And you can really do whatever you like. This is just the method that I like to use. I like to do one whole long side on the exterior and then go back and work on the way in, pinching in the fabric and sewing as I go along. That way it's as uniform as possible. And there you see in the front, just trying to make it look nice and tight and not like the fabric is too wrinkled. And of course, still keeping in mind that when you sew, the needle doesn't go through the foam, it just goes in the middle of the foam, as far superficial as it can, so closest to the surface. You don't want to go all the way through the foam. And then you just want to keep on pinching and then setting it up, so that when you sew, it is nice and uniform, pinching all the way throughout. So make sure that the back of the hat, you keep a little pocket open so that the last bit of the purple strand can fit in there, and then you can sew on top of that. That part is probably the part that I dread the most when making this hat. So moving on to the black and white zebra fabric, I just measure out 3.5 inches. I find that that is the width of the stripe fabric that I prefer for baby hats. So I just nip it and I use that as a marker right there. And then I cut out 3.5 inches of the black and white zebra fabric, and notice it's from edge to edge. Then what I do next is I fold the fabric in half and I iron that in place. Then once that's nice and ironed in place all throughout, I then fold each side in and then iron again so that you really get a narrower piece. Although I'm finding that doing this, it causes so many layers in the black and white fabric that it's hard for the needle to go through. So I might change up this strategy a bit to make it thinner so that it's easier to sew on, because my thumb and index finger are killing me from doing this. I recently actually bought a thimble to help just make the needle penetrate through this fabric, because it's just so thick and it's hard to do it. It takes much longer for each piercing. So yeah, those are things that I have found along the way. Having a good needle, a good thimble, and some really good thread, because you don't want to make any mistakes in the purple fabric especially, just because you have bad thread. And there are different qualities of thread out there. So again, like with everything, I pin ahead, and here you see me pulling it through, and I'm doing the archaic technique of using my teeth to pull the needle out. Yeah, so you see there, it's really thick, so I might make this a little thinner. So I pulled out my hat that my mom gave me for my wedding to use as a standard. So you notice in the front, I showed you there, the crisscross on the front. It's very close to the surface of the front of the head. So just make sure that that's nice and the same as a regular hat. So you'll end up with a huge long tail, and where I'm showing you there, that's where you want to be. So we just snip, snip, and that solves the problem. Just make sure that it's even on both sides. And then what you do is you just tuck it in behind there, and it gives you the illusion that that was the perfect length of zebra fabric for this little hat. And you just sew that in place. And it's even thicker fabric, so make sure to use a thimble if you need. And this is the finished product. I hope you've enjoyed it. Sharing in this process with me. I hope that you enjoy the hat that you make, whether it's one or many. And feel free to leave a comment down below and subscribe for all my latest videos. Thank you so much for joining me.